I grew up in Brooklyn, New York. Went to college at 16 years old at Queens College in New York and graduated when I was 20. And got a partial scholarship to come out to Boulder to study political science. Came out in the fall of 1965. And don't add up the years, you'll know how old I am. I hate that. But came out here as I was a teaching assistant, and I love politics. In fact, I've done a lot of concerts for politicians. I still do that, but I love music more. And I spent 2 years in graduate school here, going for a PhD, teaching also as a TA at 20 and 21 years old. And I decided I grew up going to concerts, buying in those days, LPs, and playing a little bit of a guitar and being in little folk bands. And always loved music. It was like my life. And decided one day that I was going to drop out of graduate school and try to get in the music business. I knew nothing about it, but I just wanted to follow what I wanted to follow, to the consternation of my parents. My father was a school teacher, and I came from a family where everybody was my brother's a dentist, all my cousins are doctors, or blah, 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 middle class or lower middle class, Jewish people from Brooklyn, and, education was the thing, which nothing against that, believe me, as I tell all my kids. But, so I dropped out with no idea what I was going to do, but I wanted to somehow be in the music business. And I got really lucky. I got friendly while I was the graduate student. This was 1967 when I dropped out at the end of that school year. And I got real friendly with a guy named Herbie Kavar, who was the owner of a place called The Sink, which is still open. The Sink at that time was the most successful bar. It was 3-2 beer, and the biggest 3-2 beer place in the state. And it took a half hour to get into The Sink on a Friday afternoon, just showing your ID. There was lines around the block. Everyone knows where it is, all the way down to the next corner, just to show your ID. And we had what they called FAC Club, probably still have it, I don't know, Friday Afternoon Club. And we went through about 30 kegs of beer. And well, one day I was telling Herbie, who I used to go have a beer with, I got friendly with, an older businessman who owned The Sink and a bunch of houses around campus that he rented, and that I had quit graduate school and I wanted to do something somewhere. And he said, well, it's funny, my manager at The Sink just quit, and you're a really smart kid. Why don't you come take over and manage The Sink? Well, I made sure not to tell him that I never had a business class in my life, speaking of business classes. But he thought I could do the job, so I started out running The Sink, which was a hugely successful place, especially in the 60s. I mean, it goes back 15 years. I guess the most famous guy who worked there was Robert Redford when he went to school here. He was a bartender at The Sink. And so I ran that for 2 years, and I started booking local bands in the back room in the corner and upstairs. There's a little upstairs, I don't even know what it is now. But started booking local bands, and a few of them became pretty well known. I booked a band that were a bunch of drunk college kids from CU who had dropped out, and they were playing 50s music. And they were practicing, and I went and saw them practice, and they were great. And I said, why don't you play the back room of The Sink on a Friday afternoon? And I gave them a keg of beer for money. And well, they became a band called Flash Cadillac and the Continental Kids. Your parents, if they're from here, would know about them. They later went on to be in the TV show Happy Days, like 5 or 6 times, and they were in the movie American Graffiti, and had a really wonderful career touring. They were sort of like Sha Na Na, doing oldies, and they were very funny and degenerate and wonderful, and packed The Sink, and we broke all sorts of records that day. And then I had this crazy idea, the Sink Jukebox, which is still around. I think there's a jukebox here. We had dinner with some of you guys today. Sink Jukebox, I came up with this crazy idea. This is now, you're talking 1968, right, 69, that I wanted to get the jukebox to be different. So I went to a company in Denver that made 45s. Jukebox then were 45s or singles. But the jukebox companies only played like top 40 hits. So I had songs made that were different, like the theme to The Long Ranger, and album cuts from like Led Zeppelin and stuff like that, and it became the #1 jukebox in the state. and made a bloody fortune for Herbie. And it was stuff like that that I just sort of learned naturally how to promote, I guess you'd call that. Anyway, we did very well at the Sink for a couple of years, and then in 1970, a place called Tulagis, which is no longer in existence, had gone bankrupt. Tulagis used to be in the 60s like a dance club, and it went bankrupt. And at that time, in the early 70s, Boulder was becoming a very hip musical town. In a period of a couple of years, a guy named Jim Guercio, who's still a friend of mine, opened up a recording studio called Caribou Ranch, which is on top of Netherland, and it became the most important studio in the United States. And Jimmy, who still lives up there, by the way, the studio burnt down in 1984, but everybody recorded there. Elton John recorded 5 records up there. One of them was called Caribou, because that's where he recorded it. Dan Fogelberg, who lived here, recorded almost all his albums up there. The Beach Boys, who had hits then, recorded a bunch of records. Chicago, all these bands, and it became a mecca for musicians to come. And in a period of a couple of years, Stephen Stills moved to Boulder. He lived up in Gold Hill. Joe Walsh had quit the James Gang and moved to Boulder. That was his first band, if anybody's familiar with that group. And Joe Walsh started a band called Barnstorm. That was before the Eagles now. And Stephen Stills started a band called Manassas. In fact, Joe Walsh wrote a song called Rocky Mountain Way, which was his first hit because he lived it here. People, you kids might not know that. Everybody knows who Joe Walsh is, I assume. He's in the Eagles now, but great guitar player. And a band called the Nitty Gritty Dirt Band moved to Colorado. Dan Fogelberg moved to Boulder and lived here for 10 years and then spent the rest of his life till he died last year in Pagosa Springs. A whole bunch of other musicians. Chris Hillman, who founded the Byrds, and later and the Flying Burrito Brothers moved here. And it was really becoming a mecca, and I was convinced that Boulder didn't have a rock club that had national bands. And I had this crazy idea that it was ready to have a national rock club, sort of in line with like what the Troubadour was in LA, or the Bitter End in New York, or in Chicago you had a place called the Quiet Night. And there was a whole stream of these national rock clubs. And I convinced Herbie, I didn't have 5 cents to my name, that we ought to go buy Tulagis, which he gave me a piece of, and open it up as a rock club, which we did in 1970. And in a period of 3 years, we had everybody playing there, from Bonnie Raitt's first tour, the Doobie Brothers' first tour, Linda Ronstadt's first tour, ZZ Top's first tour, Joe Walsh's first dates with Barnstorm, Stephen Stills' first date. We had so many people playing there.